I'm sure some people have said, why is the church apparently shrinking?
Yeah.
What do you, in those conversations, what do you say?
You want me to respond to that?
Sure. Why not?
Well, I think that's a very complex question, and I think partly the church has brought it on itself by being allied to the status quo and by sanctioning violence and many of those reasons. But it's also important to remember that historically,
Or you said they sanction violence?
yeah,
What do you
sanctioned
think?
state violence.
How so?
Well, the church is always allied with the state when it comes wartime. The church is pacifist between wars, but most of the church, under just war theory, is glad to pray for the nation state in the midst of war. I think historically it's also important to remember that in the United States, the church has been really inflated numerically by people who were there for all kinds of cultural reasons and had no intention of taking the gospel seriously. And what we are seeing now is that many of those people are peeling off. And my own judgment is that's not a great loss to the church, but it feels like a great loss when we get accustomed to numerical impressiveness and strength. And I think the force of secularization with technological advances encourages a sense that we can be on our own. It is said by some sociologists that there are real limits to secularization in the United States because religion has a very different dynamic in U.S. history than almost anywhere else in the world. So I think the primary thing that concerns me is that the behavior and conduct of the institutional church invites people to leave. And it's too bad that the worst expressions of the institutional church are the ones that grab public attention and distort and misrepresent what the faithful church is doing in many places. When ministry is conducted as though care for the congregants is the ultimate goal of the congregation without any missional imperative connected to it, obviously it invites passivity because we are simply on the receiving end of all the goodness of God. Whereas authentic gospel faith has to do with discipleship and missional mandates and extending oneself for the sake of the neighborhood. But that requires agency, and very much of the church does not want to disturb people with an imperative of agency.
And so you're talking about like evangelism. So when you're raising money for a church or before Easter comes for the program, you hang like door hangers. So just having the courage to go to like put door hangers about your church event. Is that what you're talking about? Agency?
I don't know what door hangers are, so
It's marketing. So you're not talking about marketing. What are you're talking about something different?
Well, I'm talking about being engaged in the practice of an alternative economics that flies in the face of our unexamined commitment to capitalism. And when the church practices any kind of alternative economics, people who are uncritically committed to capitalism become at best nervous and more than that, very often resistant to that. But obviously any reading of the gospel has to do with an alternative economics which believes that the goods of the community have to be dispatched for the sake of all the neighbors. And that kind of missional articulation breaks the passivity, and on the one hand it creates energy, on the other hand it evokes hostility. So that's the bind, I think, that church leadership often finds itself in.
That's your interpretation from reading.
That is exactly my interpretation.
Right. So,
right.
Yeah.
No footnotes.
Right.
Just me.
I thought it was about spirituality.
Well,
Condition of our heart.
it's very tricky because that is a dimension of it. But it seems to me that the church historically among us has been over-invested in spirituality that is marked, first of all, by privatism, as though it has to do with just being cozy with Jesus, and on otherworldliness, as though the demands and realities of this world are basically irrelevant to what the gospel is about. And of course, that's a huge distortion of what has been entrusted to the church.
What's been distorted?
Well, the good news of the gospel is that it is the purpose of God, and it is the embodiment of Jesus to be transforming the earth so that all of the creatures may prosper in well-being and abundance. That's the mandate, and when we act as though the news of the gospel is to be getting ready for heaven, or when we act as though the gospel is about just my well-being for me, that obviously robs the gospel of all of its energy and all of its authority.
So in regards to that mandate, what's the role of the church?
The role of the church is to be imagining the political economy according to the witness of Jesus, and then as we do that imagining, to be engaged actively, politically and socially in bringing that imagination to a historical reality.
I mean, how did Jesus embody those words that you said?
Well, the summary of it can be found, for example, in Luke 7, where John the Baptist asks Jesus if he is the Messiah, and Jesus says, I don't know whether I'm the Messiah because they haven't written the creeds yet. But then he says, go tell John that everywhere I go, stuff happens. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, and the poor rejoice. So Jesus, or the gospel narrative, is calling attention to the reality that the person and the body of Jesus is the introduction of justice and mercy and compassion into the reality of the world.
Those things all seem like spiritual. What is
nothing
what
spiritual? There's nothing spiritual about justice because it has to do with the redistribution of goods. There's nothing spiritual. Well, I wouldn't say there's nothing spiritual, but compassion is not primarily spiritual. Compassion is being bodily in solidarity with others, and particularly others in need. And mercy cannot be kept spiritual because mercy has to do with extending healing juices to people who are damaged or left behind or discounted. So it is, when Jesus says that, he is naming people that are not validated by dominant society: lame people, poor people, lepers, blind people. That's all very bodily. And the witness of the gospel is that Jesus had the energy and the authority to impinge upon bodily reality in transformative ways.
What does materiality have to do like with salvation? What's emancipatory about materiality? I mean, is that
Well, if you start with the assumption that we are elementally bodies, we're not elementally spirits, we're elementally bodies who have been inspirited by the goodness of God. But we are elementally bodies. And you can tell that by what we worry about. We worry about our bodies, we worry about where we're going to live, we worry about health care, we worry about finances, we worry about our bodies. The good news of the gospel is that the Creator God, who has made us creatures, bodily creatures, is invested in our well-being in transformative ways. And the historical temptation of the church is to talk and pray and sing as though we are primarily spirits who have been at best trapped in bodies, but in the long run we will get beyond that and live in some never land.
we are?
What?
We are? Yeah, that's it. We're going to be in it. Okay.
That is the assumption of a distorted gospel faith that puts, in my view, excessive accent on spirituality. I'm not wanting to deny the spiritual dimension. I am wanting to insist that the church has long-term been distorted by its singular investment in spirituality to the neglect of the materiality of the gospel that is attested in two very important ways. First of all, by our conviction about creation, that God called the creation good, and secondly, by our confession that Jesus is in some way we cannot understand the embodiment of God, for which we use the technical word incarnation, which simply means being embodied. And we cannot get away from the bodily reality of our faith. But if you look at the hymns of the church, by and large, the hymns of the church are an attempt to deny that or disregard that or move beyond it in very consoling ways.
Why do you think?
Because we misunderstood from the ground up. And I think that tilt toward spirituality happened, as Peter Brown has shown, in the 5th century, when rich people took over the church in the wake of Constantine. And when rich people controlled the church, what happened was that more accent got placed on spirituality and less accent on materiality, because when we have great material resources of our own, we want to keep them or we want to conceal them, and we do not want to talk about them, and we do not want to share them. So Peter Brown is this amazing historian of the church who has shown that in 1 century the subject was changed by the bishops of the church. His book is rather amazingly, it's entitled "Through the Eye of a Needle," which is an allusion to Jesus' metaphor about it's hard for a rich man to get through the eye of a needle. So one can see, according to Brown, one can see in the history of the church that the material condition of church members has greatly impacted our understanding and practice of the gospel.
You're not talking about materialism.
I'm not talking about materialism, because the ism makes it an ideology. The reason I settled on materiality is that it is a perfect parallel to spirituality. And spirituality means that we are preoccupied with the things of the Spirit. My effort is to say that's an over accent. So the parallel phrase, materiality, is an attempt to emphasize that the good news of the gospel basically pertains to the body and to the body politic.